In your view, what's wrong with private ownership of the means of production?
We should not have relations of hierarchy, dominance, subordination, centralized control over the means of life, people who give orders.
Private ownership applies all that?
Yeah.
How?
I mean, if you have private ownership of the means of production, it means that, first of all, the people, it's not just one person, it's a institution, so you get like, maybe it's a corporation or private business or something. First of all, internally, it's essentially a totalitarian institution, almost necessarily. There's a group at the top, maybe a person or a group, they make the decisions, they give orders, people down the hierarchy get the orders, and transmit them. At the very bottom, you get people who are permitted to rent themselves to survive. That's called a job, wage labor. And you get the outside community who's allowed to purchase what you produce, and of course they're very heavily propagandized to make them want to consume it even if they don't. So I mean, that's the nature of the system. It's kind of about as close to totalitarianism as you can imagine. Private enterprise works just the way Milton Friedman says. You give the worst possible service at the highest possible profit. That's what it means to be in the business. If you try to be benevolent, you're out of the business because somebody undercuts you. So the nature of the system, as insight goes way back to Adam Smith, is to be as mean and rotten as you can, to try to maximize profit and market share and give the worst possible service. Same with HMOs and everything else. The system has unacceptable risk built into it. It's well known among economists that markets are inefficient from the narrowest perspective. So to make it simple, suppose you and I, suppose you sell me a car, okay? We may make a good deal for ourselves. We're not taking into account the effect on him. It's what's called an externality. And there's an effect. If you sell me a car, it increases gas prices, increases pollution, increases congestion, and that extends very broadly. These so-called externalities can be very large. Now, in financial institutions, it's far worse. They're in the business of taking risks. If they're well managed, they calculate the potential cost to themselves if there's a loss, but the important words are to themselves. They don't calculate in what's called systemic risk, the effect on the whole system if I make, if I go bust, and there's a huge effect. The result is that risk-taking is underpriced, meaning there's a lot more of it than there would be in a reasonable system. But in your role as CEO of a corporation, you are compelled to maximize profit and to ignore what economists call externalities, that is, the impact of your transactions on others. Well, that's why we have repeated financial crises ever since Reagan and Thatcher. The deregulation of the financial institutions means that the people who run them have to ignore what's called systemic risk, the risk that a transaction is going to bring down the system. And since you ignore it, you're increasing the probability of it, and therefore it repeatedly happens. So we repeatedly have financial crises, each one worse than the last. Markets are supposed to be magnificent because they increase your choices. Actually, they restrict your choices. You think about it for a minute. Suppose I want to get home from work at night. Okay, the market offers me a choice. I can have a Ford or a Toyota. It does not offer me the choice of a Subway, what I want, what's good for me, what's good for the environment, what's good for my children, but that's not offered in the market. Markets offer individual consumption. And the enormous stress on the importance of markets is part of the way to drive people towards looking for yourself, amassing as many commodities as you can, forget everything else. In fact, if you think about it, every one of you has taken an economics course or read about it, then you know what markets are supposed to be. Markets are supposed to be systems in which informed consumers make rational choices, right? I'm sure every one of you has turned on a television set. Now, what do you see when you turn on a television set? You see that there's a huge industry, public relations industry, which began in the United States and Britain, incidentally, huge industry which is designed to undermine markets. Every ad is an attempt to create an uninformed consumer who will make an irrational choice, right? Huge effort on the part of the business world to undermine markets, but to keep the aspect that's useful for profit and power, namely separating people from one another, focusing on individual choices, not working with your neighbor. By now, about close to half the stock is owned by about 1% of the population, and the bottom 80% of the population hold about 4% of the stock. And it's always, and the corporations are interlinked, like a bank will own a big piece of one corporation. I mean, it's a massive system of highly concentrated power, given the rights of immortal persons, but without the responsibility of persons. These are amoral institutions. In fact, they are private tyrannies which are amoral and required to be amoral. They move towards, so they want to avoid monopoly because then they get public service requirements, but they want to be very limited. So just a few of them, which can have what are called strategic alliances. They can effectively act together.